Almighty God is speaking. Yes.
Greetings, hello, welcome. Hope you are doing wonderfully today, or as well as you possibly can be. And if you're not, I hope that you're rapidly approaching your highest potential in mental, physical, and spiritual strength. We're glad that you're joining us today on this day for this week's episode of Our Ancestors' Voices, a weekly program sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And our topic today is the determination of the Socialist Cuban Revolution. The determination of the Socialist Cuban Revolution. We're going to be talking about all of the accomplishments that the people of Cuba have been able to achieve under their socialist revolution, despite over six decades of sabotage against them by U.S. imperialism. So if you have a heart for humanity, you're in the right place today, and we're glad that you decided to join us. We give honor and respect to the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere, the actual indigenous people, not these fake posers that are trying to pretend that they've been here forever so they can try to get some money or whatever the scam is, the grift is about. But the real indigenous people, the people who identify as Indians, Native Americans, indigenous people, Mexicanos, Chicanos, you get the picture. Those are the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. Nobody else. Nobody else. So we give honor to them and their just struggle for justice and forward progress for their people and their communities. And we also, of course, give honor and respect to our African ancestors who, without question, have given us the blueprint for how we can advance our struggle. And we are doing everything in our power to fulfill that mission. So we are honored to be here. We're glad that you're joining us. And we just give introductions for those that may not know. The Our Ancestors' Voices program is sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, again, the AAPRP. And the APRP is a revolutionary, independent, mass, pan-African political party based in Africa. So breaking all that down, by revolutionary, we mean uncompromising change. We are committed to working to eradicate the existing international capitalist system and replacing it with worldwide socialism leading to worldwide communism. That's our objective when we say revolutionary. Independent means that we do not receive, like I had some buffoon on the internet say, go cash your check from George Soros. And I'm like, if you know how to get money from people, I wish you would talk to them about funding our work because we don't get money from any of those people. So independent means you're not dependent upon any source to finance your work. We are only dependent upon the masses of African people and other peace and justice loving people. So that's what independence means. And by mass, we mean that every African everywhere on earth is welcome, encouraged, and recruited to join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Pan-African political parties are mass. That's a part of African culture. African culture is mass. We don't have the type of vanguard parties that you would recognize from, say, the Marxist-Leninist trend out of Europe, where only a certain number of people can belong to the political party. And in a lot of instances, those people who are party members are not even known to the general population. We don't operate that way. We are a mass party. Everybody's encouraged to join. It's no secret. We introduce ourselves to you as the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We don't have front group names. We don't engage in our organizing work that way. Not criticizing those that do, but we are not from Europe. We're not a part of the European movement. We are African people, and we reflect the culture of African people, which is mass and collective. So that's what we mean by mass. And Pan-African, of course, we mean all of Africa, and every person of African descent is a part of the African nation. That's what Pan-Africanism means. It centers Africa. That's why we say our objective is Pan-Africanism. It's centered around Africa. So when we say Pan-Africanism, we don't mean, well, all Black people are united. We don't want to unite with all Black people. Some of these quote unquote Black people are the enemies of humanity. What we are saying is that all people of African descent are part of the African nation and should be committed to seeing Africa liberated. So Pan-Africanism is focused around Africa for us. And so we say the definition is a united and scientific socialist government throughout all of Africa. We don't recognize the colonial borders, the 54 countries in Africa. We didn't create those. We didn't make ourselves African Americans. We didn't impose English on ourselves. We didn't bring ourselves over to this hemisphere. We didn't do any of that. So I don't see why we have to respect it. Some of you operate under these colonial borders. Well, I'm America. I don't pay attention to you. What you've done there is you have allowed your colonizer to shape your worldview. We refuse to do that. We absolutely refuse to do that. And ignorance is never an excuse for argumentation. If you don't know, you need to take time to find out. You shouldn't be proud of being ignorant about something. I don't know nobody in Africa. That's ignorant. Don't brag about that. That's not a flex to brag about being ignorant. I don't know where we got to when we got to this point where being ignorant was a flex and people thought that was something good to talk about how dumb you are about something. Like that's not impressive. So this is not what we want to do. So when we talk about Pan-Africanism, that's what we're talking about. One unified socialist Africa. And our work to achieve Pan-Africanism is outlined clearly in Kwame Nkrumah's Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. If you're looking at a screen, it's displayed on the screen here. The cover is outstanding book that lays out the strategy to unite all of the revolutionary Pan-African formations on the ground who are working to achieve Pan-Africanism under the definition I just provided to you, one unified socialist Africa. That's our work. That's the primary objective of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And if you want to understand, well, how are you going to do that? Then you should read the book and have questions, and we're happy to answer them for you. And Our Ancestors' Voices, the program, is hosted each week by myself, Ajamu. I am a committed organizer in the All African People's Revolutionary Party for over 41 years. And my biological and ideological daughter, Shakura, Dr. Shakura Umi, who has been an organizer in the AAPRP for approaching 5 years. Shakura is not here for the next couple of weeks. She is out of the country. She is in the Caribbean. If you want a clue as to where she is, pay attention to this program today. Um, those that don't know, if you don't know, you ain't supposed to know. So that's where she is, doing very wonderful work to advance the worldwide struggle for human progress. And we are going to talk today about the Cuban Revolution. January 1st, 2026, of course, commemorates 67 years since January 1st, 1959, when the Cuban Revolution was victorious. And the picture you see on the screen is Fidel Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara coming into Havana for the celebration of the victory of the revolution. In actuality, on January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro went into Havana, the capital city of Cuba, to meet with the other organizers of the urban network, to meet the guerrillas, people like Vilma Espin, the wife of Raul Castro, who made her physical transition some years ago, and Frank Paz and the other organizers of the urban network that organized all the mass strikes and disruptions and really did wonderful work to ensure that the Cuban dictatorship run under Batista at that time was unable to function, which led people to see the importance of supporting the revolution and was a large factor in helping the revolution, the guerrilla warfare, become victorious. So Fidel marched into Havana. Che Guevara actually was leading tanks into the city of Santa Clara in Cuba. So this picture represents the celebration that they had later. But just for the brief history, in case you don't know it, or if you do, because we're going to tell it correctly, is on January 1st, 1959, Cuban rebel troops marched into Havana, which signaled, led by Fidel Castro, which signaled the victory of the Cuban Revolution and the fall of the Batista regime. Batista fled and went to Europe, wherever the hell he went, and left Cuba. And as I mentioned, Che Guevara led another contingent of guerrillas into Santa Clara. The urban network, which I mentioned, Vilma Espin, very important figures in the Cuban Revolution, Frank Paz, Massetti, and all of those others met the guerrilla fighters throughout the country, and Cuba thumbed its nose at international imperialism, January 1st, 1959, which was led by the U.S. and is still led by the U.S. today. And the purpose of the program today is to discuss that despite all the attacks the U.S. has waged against the Cuban Revolution, they have provided a supreme example to you about courage and dignity because they have never surrendered and they will never surrender. The Cuban Revolution continues today. And many of us within the APRP, especially, we have studied the Cuban Revolution for decades. We have engaged in principled relationships with the Cuban Revolution. And we have done that because the Cuban Revolution, as we'll demonstrate during this presentation, has shown over and over and over again their commitment to helping Africa achieve its liberation, helping African people achieve our self-determination. And so the only thing we could do for them is to make sure that we consistently educate people about their revolution and try to get people to understand the necessity of supporting their revolution, especially since they are under such vicious attack by the most powerful country on the planet Earth. So we'll start that by talking about some of the backstory, right? And the picture you see on your screen right now is a picture of a jail cell in Mexico City, Mexico, in 1955. And in that jail cell, a number of Cubans were arrested, convicted, and placed in that prison. And they were placed there because they had organized in 1953 the raid on the Moncada garrison. And the Moncada garrison uh, is it was a military compound where weapons were stored, and it's in the city of Santiago de Cuba. And when I went to Cuba, I went to the Moncada garrison, and it's now a museum. But this is what happened. And so Fidel, Raul, Juan Almeida, the brother, and all of those Cubans were arrested, convicted, and sent to prison in Mexico City. A young Ernesto Guevara was, if you know the story, there was a movie about it, The Motorcycle Diaries. He was a medical student. He graduated, became a medical doctor. And as a very young man, he was riding his motorcycle through Central South America with a friend of his. And he came upon Guatemala. He came into Guatemala and he saw the resistance the people of Guatemala were uh, engaged in against the neo-colonial government. And as a result, the people of Guatemala elected in a democratically staged election Jacobo Arbenz as their president, a socialist leaning president. And the U.S. staged a coup d'etat to overthrow Arbenz's government in 1954. And Che Guevara was in Guatemala, and he saw how vicious, brutal, and incorrect the coup d'etat was. He saw through the lies of neocolonialism, imperialism. And he understood that the reason why the coup d'etat in Guatemala happened was because Arbenz was attempting to nationalize all of the agriculture, which then was controlled by a corporation called the United Fruit Corporation, which today is Chiquita Banana. Same people. That's what imperialists do. They just change their face and you don't know the history, so they fool you that way, but they don't fool us because we know the history. And so Che was politicized through that. And that's important because a lot of people, a lot of reactionaries and enemies of humanity point to the Motorcycle Diaries, the book and the movie, where Che made, as a 22-year-old man, some disparaging remarks against African people. And they point to that to say, well, he was racist. And they want to use that to attempt to discredit him. But we understand that all of us are unconscious until we become conscious, right? All of us. You said the N word this morning, or at least last night. So, how the hell are we going to criticize a 22-year-old man who didn't know a damn thing? But what happened, what he saw in Guatemala, it politicized him. And he was arrested engaging in protest against the illegal coup d'etat against the Arbenz regime. He wasn't Guatemalan. He was just someone who saw that justice needed to be achieved. So he did that. And as a result, he was arrested and convicted. And the brutal error that imperialism made is they put him in the same cell with the Cubans there in Mexico City. And the second, more important error they made is they released all of them. Imagine that. If they had not done that, what would have happened with the Cuban Revolution? What would have happened with it? They made a brutal error. They let them all go. Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Juan Almeida, Ernesto Che Guevara, all of the leading militants in the Cuban Revolution, they let them go. And the rest is history. I mentioned that, Ernesto Guevara was a medical student. He, as was a common practice in Argentina, especially during those years of the 1950s, when you would say something that people agreed with, they would answer by saying, Che. Just like here, a popular culture thing to do here is you say something people like and they say word. That was what people did in Argentina. They would say Che. So when the Cubans were talking about their determination to bring revolution to Cuba, Che kept saying Che, Che. So the Cubans thought that was funny. So they nicknamed him Che. And that's where the name Che came from, referring to him. In fact, he's more known today as Che Guevara than Ernesto Guevara. But this is what happened. And that night, after listening to the Cubans, Che asked them, Argentina-born Che, if he could join the struggle to bring revolution to Cuba. And of course, they said yes. And again, the rest was history. They were placed in the same jail. Imperialism had all of them and released them. And as we're about to display, this would prove to be, I would argue, one of the biggest errors imperialism has ever made. So let's talk about the trials and the growth of the Cuban Revolution, right? The early days of the revolution in the 1960s and 70s, and even the 1980s, the Cuban Revolution was heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. At that time, you had the Cold War, you had the Soviet Union, supposedly the East against the United Snakes in the West. United States had the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO as its military wing, that it was the leading force behind and still is today. And the Soviet Union had what they called the Warsaw Pact, which were all the countries in Eastern Europe, countries like not only the Soviet Union, which was all the territories Russia, if you want to say gathered or annexed or whatever way you want to put it, like Ukraine or Georgia, all those areas became the Soviet Union. But then you also had other countries like Romania, at that time, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all of these countries, and the borderline between Eastern world and the Western world, the capitalist world and the socialist, so-called socialist world at that time was Germany, and Germany was split in two. There was West Germany and East Germany. They had the Berlin Wall that separated the two, right? And of course, at that time, what was happening is that that was the battle, the Cold War, the fight, the nuclear weapons buildup. This is why we've talked about the intense struggle once the Congo became independent, because the Congo had then and still does today have the largest supply of uranium in the world. And uranium is what you use to make uh, plutonium, which creates atomic power and nuclear power. So this is why the Congo was such a hot spot and still is today because of all the resources that are there. But this is what the all of these countries were fighting over, and that's why Patrice Lumumba was assassinated shortly after becoming prime minister, and the Congo has been in a state of chaos ever since, because the chaos benefits the capitalist corporations that need the cobalt, the coltan, all of the resources that come out of that country and all over Africa, right? That's their plan. That's why they just bombed Nigeria and told you it's because they were protecting Christians. And if you know the story, we did that. We did a program. You should look it up if you missed it. But over the last damn near 20 years, there have been about 2,000 so-called Christians killed in Nigeria. There have been about 50,000 so-called Muslims killed during that same period in Nigeria. So there's clearly no genocide against Christians. What there is the mad rush to steal resources that exist in Nigeria, that exists all over Africa. That's why we need Pan-Africanism. But getting back to Cuba, the Soviet Union was there and was heavily supportive of Russia. I'm sorry, of Cuba, and was at that time the major supplier of aid to Cuba. Like the U.S. cut Cuba off from the capitalist world, so the Soviet Union was Cuba's main trade partner. They gave Cuba inflated prices for Cuba's goods to help Cuba stay afloat. Right? That's the things that they did. They gave Cuba military mechanisms to protect the country, to protect the island. And as a result, the Cuban Revolution in many ways modeled itself after the Soviet Union. Even if you go to Russia today, there are a lot of people with Russian names like Vladimir and Natasha and Svetlana. And the Cuban economy even was modeled after the Soviet Union. They had what they called an auto finance economy. If you understand economics, what that meant is, you have a cash crop type of economy, and everything is based on subsidies, and that's the basis of sustainability in your economy. Now the problem is that the Cuban society is completely different than the Soviet Union. The Cubans are an island country in the Caribbean. The Soviet Union is in Eastern Europe, in one of the coldest parts of the world. So there were a lot of difficulties that Cuba had from an economic standpoint in terms of attempting to consolidate the consistency of their revolution's ability to produce. And also, there were cultural problems because Cuba, again, is in the Caribbean. It's a country that reflects the history of the Western Hemisphere, which over the last 500 years has been defined by colonialism and slavery. And Cuba, just like the United States, is no different than that. It's a manifestation of Europeans who are descendants of settlers and colonizers, indigenous people who were wiped out in that region, and Africans who were enslaved and taken there. And that's totally different than Russia, which is still today primarily a homogenous society of European people. So there were cultural manifestations, but because Cuba was following the model of the Soviet Union, there were conflicts. For many years, up through the 1970s, for example, it was frowned upon in Cuba for Africans to identify with any element of African culture. Of course, when the Black Power movement jumped off in this country in the late 60s, it was frowned upon to a large degree for Africans in Cuba to identify with that, which they did. Things like wearing afros were frowned upon, all of this kind of stuff. And of course, it wasn't a progressive society as it related to things like LGBTQ, but you can't blame that on the revolution. That was already there. That's all over the Caribbean. That's machismo culture. That was already there. It was just the Cuba had it, just like Jamaica has it, just like Puerto Rico has it, just like the Dominican Republic has it. All of those countries have that. So these were some of the contradictions that were encountered. And then in 1962, once Cuba declared itself a socialist revolution, the US immediately imposed its economic blockade. And what that means is that from the time that blockade went into effect in 1962, and it's still operational today, 63 years later, Cuba was prohibited from trading with any countries within the capitalist sphere of influence. And if you look around the world today, there are really only a handful of countries that are not within the capitalist sphere of influence. You're talking about China. I'm talking about countries that can do whatever they want, regardless of what the capitalist world thinks. So you're talking about China, North Korea, Vietnam, and that's essentially it. To even a far lesser extent, Venezuela, Libya was there, but the imperialism destroyed that in 2011. And so what that meant is that now Cuba was unable to get all of the trade elements that the capitalist countries control. So they weren't able to get new cars into Cuba. They weren't able to get car parts. Cars break down, they need parts. They weren't able to get appliances. More importantly, they weren't able to get medicines that they needed because the US prohibited countries from trading with them. They got a limited supply of those things from the countries I mentioned, primarily China, but that's limited in terms of what they could get. So they had to engage once the Soviet Union fell in 1990 to 92. The Cuba was able to sustain some level of efficiency because, again, they had the Soviet Union as a trade partner. But once the Soviet Union fell in the early 90s, Cuba was on its own. And again, they had, the few trade partners I talked about, but, China has always been a country that did things based primarily on their interests. Cuba hasn't. Cuba's done a lot of things around the world to benefit humanity that they got nothing out of because they understand that type of international solidarity. China, I can't say that to the same degree. China has always acted in their interest. That's why they've done strange things like support the neo-colonialist, imperialist-backed FNLA in Angola against the popular movement for the liberation of Angola, which was clearly the popular choice and the correct choice. They've always done things like that. China has. So yeah, they trade with Cuba today, but most of what China does is again going to be based on what's in China's interest. So the reason why China is in Africa is because Africa has what they need. They have all those people in China. They got to feed all those people. So they need resources, right? So where are the resources? They're in Africa. They're not in Cuba, they're in Africa. So I'm not saying this to disparage China because China does a lot of trade with Cuba, and Cuba would be even worse shaped than it is if it were not for that. But their commitment to doing that is based on, their moral understanding of supporting revolutions. But I'm just saying his history has proven that's not always their primary reason for doing what they do. They deal with Africa because they need resources and they trade the construction of infrastructure for resources. They build roads, they do all these things in Africa, all throughout Africa. You see this. They have buildings they've built all over Africa. I've seen many of them. And in exchange, they get access to the resources. So that's what they do. So I'm saying that because some of you think that, well, China, they're no different than Europe and America. No, it's a big difference. And anybody that says there isn't a difference, they don't know a damn thing about Africa. I've been there all over the continent. I've studied it extensively. It's not nearly the same. The U.S. and Europe, their colonization and neo colonization of Africa, they've left nothing in Africa. They haven't built one road anywhere that you can point to, unless they built it to allow themselves, when they were there, to have good access. And when they left, it just got left behind. But they built nothing in exchange for what they stole from Africa. You don't come in here with that nonsense, because we know better. But so that's what happened there. And also battles over relations with China, because in the 60s there was a huge battle. They called it the Sino-Soviet split. There was a battle between China and the Soviet Union to determine, who would be the leading socialist country in the world, right? And this happened. And, that created problems for Cuba. That was one of the reasons. This is a whole nother workshop topic, which we'll probably do. But that split was one of the reasons that Che Guevara, who was at that time identified closely with the Chinese Revolution, while the Soviet Union was the primary trade partner for Cuba. And this was one of the reasons Che Guevara did a speech in Algeria in 1964, in which he was very critical of the Soviet Union. In fact, he called the Soviet Union an imperialist power. And after he came back from Cuba, this is shortly after that, is when he resigned his minister post in Cuba, and then he disappeared. And of course, he turned up later, and he was in the Congo at first fighting there, and then he turned up in Bolivia, where he unfortunately lost his life. But that was a lot of the reason for that, because the Soviet Union was not trying to have Che Guevara be in leadership in Cuba with his level of popularity, which is still there today, and have that happen when they were trying to win influence against China. So all of these things were happening. And again, the fall of the Soviet Union created what they call the special period, where Cuba had to rely on itself primarily to sustain its socialist revolution, right? And we should talk for a moment about how they were able to do that, because the way that they have done that should serve as an inspiration for the entire planet. Because mostly what we're taught is that what's the saying? You can't fight City Hall. You can't defeat capitalism. You have to just compromise with it. I'm so tired of hearing that shit. I've heard it my whole life. If you're just too goddamn scared to fight back, just say that. Just say, I'm a punk ass coward and I just don't want to do anything to risk my comfort. So I'm just going to run this line that we have to just compromise with this system and figure out a way to coexist with it. Just say that. You're not fooling us. You're not fooling anybody that is here and tired of this and wants to fight. All you're doing is exposing yourself for the coward that you are. So Cuba has never done that. And because of that, that's why they should be a living example for how we can move forward. So let's talk about some of the ways they did that. They've always adapted their ingenuity, figuring out ways to compensate for the lack of spare parts due to the embargo, the blockade, figuring out ways to still get what they needed. And one of the most successful things they've been able to do is develop this biomedical industry in Cuba, where they could not get pharmaceuticals because of the US-led economic blockade. And so instead of that, they learned how to plant and grow medicinals that could cure people. And they've done that. Now, they still get some pills, and they've even been able to replicate through that biomedical industry some of the medicinals that come through pharmaceuticals. And from that, they've been able to do outstanding work. In the 2020s, Cuba became the first country on earth to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmissions. They don't have that in Cuba. It's still a thing in the US. They don't have that in Cuba. They also eliminated cervical cancer. It doesn't exist. Millions of people get tested every year for cervical cancer here. It doesn't exist there. And all of these types of things are due to their socialist system, where healthcare is free and it's placed at a priority. Socialism demands a planned economy, everyone. That means that what they do, they have 12 million people in Cuba. So they break that down as a part of their planning and they figure out how many doctors do we need. You can do the math, pull out a calculator. How many doctors do you need in Cuba to make sure that there's a doctor for, say, every 1,000 people? So they do that math and they make the education's free. Everybody can get education free there, college education. Everybody can get medical training free. In fact, they provide medical training to thousands of students here from the US. Come back, go to Cuba, get their medical degree, come back here and slay the board exams. Better than people who go to medical school in this backward ass country. They do this and they don't charge any guy. I mean, I don't know how else to say this to you all. They do what they do out of a commitment for creating a better world. A lot of people can't understand that because you don't do a damn thing for anybody other than yourself. But they do this out of commitment for creating a better world. This is the basis of socialist development. That's what socialist development is all about. So that's how they have their healthcare system established. And I've said many times, I got a root canal when I was there, free of charge. I still can't believe it was free because I got to pay every time I go to the dentist in this cesspool. Every time I got to pay something, even if it's just a copay, which most of the time it is, because when I got that root canal, they talked to me through an interpreter for 45 minutes. They helped me understand oral hygiene that I never learned growing up in the inner city, going to those crackpot dentists whenever I did, which was rare. So because of that, I haven't had a cavity since. And that was 1994. I haven't had a cavity in my mouth in over 30 years. And that is the direct credit of the Cuban Revolution. Every time I go to the dentist, boy, your teeth look so good. Where'd that root canal come in? I said in Havana, Cuba. I say socialist Havana, Cuba, and they never. There's never any follow up after that when I say that. So this is what they've been able to accomplish. This is phenomenal. They even had when I was in Cuba in 1994, as I've said many times, I got a chance to meet our late revolutionary sister Sada Shakur and was able to hang with her for several days. And she was the reports we had heard at that time is that she was writing a book and a second book because her autobiography came out in 1987. Now I don't know, what happened, why she, the book never emerged after that. But what she told me when we were there are a lot of reasons. I write books. I know, because I had to say this because some of you are so, oh, the Cuban government wouldn't let her release the book. So I have to say this to people that think like that is I write books. I'm writing my sixth one right now. And it's one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life. And I understand a lot of people start books and don't finish them. The majority of people that start books don't end up publishing them. So there's a lot of reasons why that could happen. But my point is that I talked to her when I was there, and she said that some of the youth had arranged her computer to be able to work off of a car battery because they had outages in electricity because we've talked about the impacts of the US-led economic blockade and eliminating resources. So just the ingenuity of the people. And then Cuba's educational system has been lauded by even imperialist entities like the World Health Organization. You can go on their site and read about how they praise the Cuban educational system. I've done it, the United Nations. And Cuba's not even a part of these organizations because they're imperialist organizations. And they still have to acknowledge what Cuba's been able to accomplish and their curriculum. So, I mentioned machismo culture, patriarchy, right? Homophobia, those things exist there like they do throughout all of the Caribbean, throughout the United States of America. But what the difference is here in this country, if you contrast backward ass US with socialist Cuba, in this country, they don't even acknowledge that any of this is a problem. They don't even acknowledge, the government has never officially acknowledged racism. They don't even acknowledge it. They deny it. They've never acknowledged the impacts of slavery. They've never acknowledged the impacts of the Homestead Act and stealing the indigenous people's land. They've never acknowledged exploiting the Chinese people to build railroads. They've never acknowledged denying women the right to dictate what happens in their own bodies. They've never acknowledged being homophobic. They've never acknowledged any of this, even in 2025. By contrast, the Cuban Socialist Society has placed African history as a curriculum in their schools for their children. They have Marilena Castro, who is the daughter of Vilma Espin and Raul Castro. Was the director of social services in Cuba, and their school system have LGBTQ curriculum. So, if you understand revolution, the point of it is you provide free education. So everybody has education. There's no problem with education. You make sure education is available, that you have schools where there are only enough students so that the teachers can reach all of them. Not like here where there's 1,000 students for one teacher, and so they just criminalize the students. It's like a jail yard. They don't have that like that. So the students get the attention they need and deserve. And with that curriculum in place, the students learn a different type of worldview. And as a result, one generation, two generations, because yeah, there's people with racist ideas in Cuba. There's people with patriarchal ideas, homophobic ideas. But as you begin to make this type of progressive and revolutionary education normalized and consistent and sustainable, eventually 2 or 3 generations, those people will die off, and people that are coming up will have a different type of consciousness. This is what you have to understand about revolution. For example, in Cuba today, I haven't looked at it in a while, but I check it periodically. But I know at least 75% of the people living in Cuba today were born after the revolution, after 1959. So what that means, you all, is that these are people who have grown up only with free healthcare, only with free education. They've grown up with this. So you will not ever be able to impose capitalist healthcare insurance companies on them. You will never be able to impose student loans on them. You accept that because you don't, that's all you know, and you're afraid to struggle. You don't want to struggle against it. You just want to complain about it. All you want to do is just complain about it. They should charge you that. They should charge you $1 million to walk down the goddamn street. If you're not going to fight against them, they should do that. The minute you come out your house, if you don't want to engage in a strike fight for justice, the minute you come out of your house, these Gestapos should stop you and charge you $1,000 to take another step. And if you don't pay them the $1,000, they should shoot your goddamn ass. Because if you're not going to do anything to make the world a better place, get the hell out the way. I used to say this, and people told me don't say it when I was in my 20s, so I stopped saying it, but I've started saying it again. I don't give a goddamn. I used to say when I gave presentations, if you're not going to do anything to help the people, get a phone book, because that's what we had then. We didn't have internet. Get a phone book. Find the local Ku Klux Klan office, because we didn't have Proud Boys and Oath Keepers in. We just had Ku Klux Klan. Call them and say, is this the Ku Klux Klan? Yes, it is. I refuse to live for my people, so I want to give you my address so when you get ready to lynch one of us, I can die for my people. I believe that. I'm sorry. You think that's bad? That's your damn problem. I believe you're not going to do anything to help. Get the hell out the way. But these wonderful people in Cuba, their education system is outstanding. Outstanding. So they will do everything human beings can do with the process I just laid out to eradicate backward thinking. Whereas here, they're eliminating ethnic studies. They're going backwards, eliminating this stuff so that people are getting dumber and dumber and dumber and dumber and knowing less and less and less and less. People here don't even know like how they got to be where they are. Immigrants in this country know nothing about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, nothing about that. African people know nothing about the Black Power movement and how it influenced this entire world and the country. You wear your hair long, you have facial hair, you have long hair, you have braids, you have locks, you have tattoos. You owe all of that shit to the Black Power movement Because before the Black Power movement, you could not go to school anywhere with any of that. You could not work anywhere with any of that. It was the Black Power movement led by people like Kwame Ture, Mukasa Dada, Ruby Doris Robinson, and all of these people who risked their lives for this movement. They were the ones who paid the price. And because they did that, now you can do these things. Because what the Black Power movement did is it said, we're going to be who we are, whether you like it or not. And that spread. From that, you had the women's liberation movement. From that, you had what they called at that time the gay liberation movement. All of that stemmed from the Black Power movement. And the people in those other movements who were honest admitted that. Dennis Banks and Clyde Belcourt, who founded the American Indian Movement, they said the Black Power movement influenced them to start the American Indian Movement. They were honest. They said that. So this is important because you don't have anything happening in this country to advance education. It's going backwards. Whereas in Cuba, they're doing everything to educate their society free of charge. So let's talk about the resilience of the Cuban Revolution. Let's talk about the strategy of the U.S. blockade. They want to cripple. The whole strategy behind the blockade for over 60 years has been to cripple the Cuban Revolution, to prevent the Cuban, because, they say they're against socialism. They say socialism is a failure. They say it can never work. All of you have heard them say that, and a lot of you believe that it can never work. Socialism can never work. Well, if something will never work, leave it alone and let it fail. Why do you have to do everything you can to sabotage it? Then it's not that it won't work. It's that it has a difficult time working with you consistently sabotaging it. It's like me getting with you and beating the hell out of you every day. Well, where is that person? Well, they don't want to come out and do anything for themselves. That's a scam. That's what that is. That's a scam because they know socialism will work. That's why they do everything they can to sabotage it. And other places where they've engaged in these anti-communist sanctions and organize, they haven't been able to consolidate to the degree that the Cuban Revolution has. So they've had more success with their sanctions in some other places. They've had greater success, but they haven't been able to stop the Cuban Revolution, and they never will. They never will. But let's talk about, that's their strategy. That's what they want to do, because what they want to do is starve the people against the revolution. Get people to the point, they did this in the 90s with Nicaragua. The Sandinistas, they were able to have so many economic sanctions that the right-wing candidate won the election because people wanted to eat. And this is what they do, but they haven't had that success in Cuba, and they never will. So this is important to understand. And I just want to talk about the things that the Cuban Revolution has done to defeat U.S. imperialism. It's amazing how successful they've been at destroying U.S. imperialism. And I'll talk about COVID era first. The COVID era, Cuba was able to use their antiviral medication that they developed in the 1980s, 1981 to be exact, to combat HIV. That's why they've been so successful with that. The U.S. was still denying the AIDS virus in 1981. They were still denying it in 1991. Cuba invented this antiviral drug, and they were treating people. That's why they never had a huge issue with that. And with the COVID outbreak, they used this antiviral drug while they were working to develop an actual antidote to COVID, and they used it in Cuba, and they had over 95% of the people took the vaccine. That's why they didn't have that same struggle that you had here. You had hundreds of thousands of people die here because of that, because there was nothing done. None of them did any goddamn thing to solve it. Not to the extent that they should have and could have, because a lot of you are apologists for the capitalist system. Well, I got this out of it. They did this for me. I don't give a damn. Nobody cares what they did for you. This is the most powerful country in the world. If all you got is they did something for you and you benefit from this, you just ain't shit. That doesn't mean anything. If it's not about improving the conditions for the masses, it doesn't mean a damn thing. And you're telling us you ain't shit when you sit there talking about what you got, what they did for you. and nobody else got it, or most people didn't get it, it doesn't mean a damn thing. It doesn't mean anything. All it means is that you ain't shit. That's all. All you care about is yourself. That's all it means, which we already knew that. So anyway, back to this. So they were able to use this antiviral drug. They used it in dozens of countries around the world, primarily in Africa. That's why to this day, Africa never had serious outbreaks except in the parts of Africa where the Europeans are, like Zimbabwe and Tanzania, where I'm going in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks. Though they had COVID outbreak problems, but all of the other countries, it never was an issue because Cuba, because of largely because of Cuba's contribution there. And of course, they developed the antidote, like I said, and people took it, and they didn't have. This is what they've been able to do. But let's talk about what they've done, right, to combat U.S. imperialism. The first thing was the revolution itself. Obviously, Batista was a puppet of the U.S., and they were able to defeat the Batista regime in 1959. And then right after that, in 1961, working with all these reactionary people who fled the Cuban Revolution and went to Florida. And for the record, 98% of the so-called Cuban exiles in southern Florida are Europeans. They're white people. That's why Cuba's emerged as primarily an African country pretty much now, because all the white people left, as they should have. They went from one slave economy to another, coming here. Of course, that's what they would do. But in 1961, the CIA organized some of this backward scum, and they went into Cuba with Green Berets to try to overthrow the Cuban Revolution at Playa del Carmen, what they call the Bay of Pigs, and they failed miserably. That was their first defeat. Then the next year, in 1962, missiles were placed in Cuba, pointed here against the U.S., nuclear missiles. And the way you learned it, because most of you only studied with what the capitalists told you, is that the U.S. Intimidated Cuba and the Soviet Union against to remove those missiles. They called it the crisis in October of 1962. There's movies about it. There's all kind of stuff where Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, and John F. Kennedy, the president of the U.S., they had the showdown, the Cold War at its highest point. Nuclear weapons were going to be launched. There's so many damn movies about that. So you can't say you don't know. You should look it up. You should read about it, really. But what ended up happening, the reason why the missiles were removed from Cuba facing the U.S. is because the reason the missiles were placed there in the first place is because the U.S. had placed missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. So the negotiation was that you take those missiles down pointing at us, and the missiles pointing at you will be taken down. Another defeat. And not to mention the hundreds, probably thousands of times the U.S. has attempted to murder Fidel Castro through poisoning his food, poisoning the cigars, sending assassins into Cuba. There was a documentary, I'll get the name of it and share it with you. There's a documentary that came out in the 80s, and they recruited all of these mafioso hitmen, badass mafioso hitmen, the most dangerous people on earth. And that's how you're raised to believe. And they sent these people down to Cuba to assassinate Fidel Castro. And they sent, in the documentary, they were saying at least 20 to 25 of them down there. Separate missions, probably more, much more, to assassinate Fidel Castro. They never heard from these people again. Never heard from them. And you want to tell me that the people in Cuba don't support the Cuban Revolution? There's no way that would be the reality unless that revolution had tremendous popular support. And the U.S. couldn't even ask about these goddamn scum because they sent them there illegally in the first place. They tell you they're against illegal immigration. They sent all these goddamn criminals down there to assassinate the leader of an entire country. Defeat for U.S. imperialism. Then if you go to the 80s and 90s, after Ernesto Che Guevara went to the Congo and took 100 Cubans to combat the neo-colonial forces backed by Mobutu Sese Seko, who was the CIA's man that they used to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. It made him the head of state in the Congo, the richest man in Africa at that time. And he was the dictator in the Congo. And Che Guevara went there to fight with Laurent Kabila, who had taken over the national Congolese movement after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the military contingent. And they were fighting against Mobutu's forces. And Che was there battling with them. And they were not able to win that fight, but Che went to Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, and lived in the Cuban embassy for several months. And I mentioned when I went to Dar es Salaam in 2016, the Cuban ambassador allowed me, and this clearly was not something they do to everybody. I was talking to him about Che Guevara being there, and he was so impressed with my knowledge of it, just off the top of my head, that he said, "Let me show you something." And he took me, showed me where Che lived. I mean, you could ask the comrades I went with. I got emotional. I saw where the man lived, where he studied, where he did everything. And it was there that he made his contacts with liberation movements in Africa. And that led to the late 1980s, where Cuba, small Cuba, suffering under an economic blockade, was able to send 500,000 troops to Southern Africa to fight off mercenaries and racist apartheid. And they were victorious. They set it up. They had Victor Drake Cruz was the commander, and he stayed that until he made his physical transition just a few short years ago. But what they accomplished is phenomenal. You don't know anything about it. They don't talk about it, and they never will. But the way that Nelson Mandela was freed from prison is that the Cubans had to leave Southern Africa. Namibia got its independence if the Cubans left Southern Africa. Angola, free if the Cubans left Southern Africa. And apartheid was on its last legs and didn't last but a couple of more years, largely because of the contribution of the Cubans. And they got nothing for that. They weren't looking for anything for that. They got nothing for that because they understood their international responsibility and solidarity. This was a poor country struggling under a blockade, and they went clear across the world. The Soviet Union didn't send 1,000 troops to fight against those mercenaries and the apartheid regime. I'm just telling the truth. And the U.S. backed the racist apartheid regime all the way to the very end. But Cuba stood tall. That's why you can't tell us nothing about Cuba. We know defeat for U.S. imperialism. Elian Gonzalez, the young boy in 2000, was kidnapped, came here with his mama on a raft. Mama died. Sister and her boyfriend, an African, lived. They don't tell you that. You don't know about that. And the boyfriend went to Cuba and said he had never faced so much racism in his life. They didn't tell you about that. There's a whole book about it called Cuban Confidential. You should read it so you don't be ignorant. Nothing, you don't want to brag about being ignorant. Defeat for U.S. imperialism. Elian Gonzalez is back in Cuba and is an official in the Cuban Communist Party today. Defeat for American imperialism. And then we talk about all of the African political prisoners who Cuba has graciously accepted over the years, from Robert Williams in 1962, who's escaping being lynched from North Carolina because he dared to say that Africans should arm themselves against Ku Klux Klan and police terrorism. Went to Cuba and was able to start Radio Free program there before he moved on to China. He was there in 1962. Eldridge Cleaver went there in 1968, acted a fool, and had to leave. They made him leave, as they should have. Huey P. Newton lived in Cuba 3 years, from 1972 to 1975, the co-founder and ideologue for the Black Panther Party. And of course, our sister Sata Shakur, who's on the screen, showed up there in 1984 and thankfully, to the Cuban Revolution, lived out her life there until her physical transition in September of this year. And just for the record, the Obama administration said that they would talk about lifting the Cuban blockade if the Cubans, Raul Castro at the time, would consider returning Assata Shakur to the U.S. And Raul Castro told Obama that discussion is not on the table. And Assata was able to transition peacefully in Cuba, and that would never have happened without the Cuban Revolution. These people understand principles. That's why we love them. They understand principles. If you don't understand principles, that's why you don't understand us. So we give thanks and honor to the Cuban Revolution. We always have and we always will. Forever. As long as we live, we will stand with them. And if the U.S. attacks them, they're going to have an automatic fifth column in this country. They already do. They know that. But we want to invite you back next week, January 4th. January 1st is the Cuban Revolution, but it's also the Haitian Revolution. 1804 was the Haitian Revolution. And so we're going to talk about the continued savage attacks against the Haitian people next week. So I want to invite you to come back. The QR code in the upper left, the red and white one, you have all the AAPRP programs, so check it out. You have the Forward Ever shop. You know you spend all this money on with these capitalist corporations. So go ahead and spend some money buying revolutionary African clothing that can help us do our work. We would appreciate that. And then for those of you in the Sacramento area, we continue to have our community self-defense. Come exercise your mind and your body so that when hopefully you're not having to use the skills, but if you do, you'll be prepared. Every Thursday we have it. We had class last Thursday. I don't celebrate capitalist holidays. We will have class this Thursday, New Year's Day, 6 to 8 p.m., 2775 Cottage Way, Cottage, Cottage Way, Unit 15, 6 to 8 p.m. You don't have to sign up. You don't have to do anything. You just got to show up and be ready to exercise your mind and your body, okay? So come out so you can do that. Let people know. Join the AAPRP. Go to aaprp-intl.org and do that. The QR code in the bottom right, the black and white one, is for Burkina Books, which is our work on the ground in the Sahel in Africa, Burkina Faso, and Niger to bring revolutionary literature to organize our people for revolution. Become a monthly sponsor, however much you can, $5, $10, $20, whatever you can do that. Buy my book, A Guide for Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence, A Guide for Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence. The QR code for that is right next to it. Tell people, call your library, have them order it. Call your bookstore, have them order it. 100% of the funds go towards anti-fascist supplies and work. We got all the supplies we need for self-defense. So buy my book and we can continue to do that. We appreciate you. Forward ever, onward. Viva the Cuban Revolution. Viva Africa. Viva Revolution. Forward ever. Have a great rest of your evening.